That's a good place. That's a good
Yeah,
place to start. Let's start
yeah.
there. So, Marg, I'm going to ask you to tell Restorative Justice on the Rise viewers why this book was so hard to write and why we had to keep taking turns telling our publisher it was going to be late. Like they kept giving us a date, and we literally would take turns. Like, no, it's your turn to just email the publisher and tell them it's not coming
Yeah,
because it was really hard to write for a whole bunch of reasons.
yeah.
And so I'm curious, like, t tell me the history of this book. Like, how did this book come about?
Oh, well, I suppose I had a history of publishing with Jessica Kingsley Publishers. I've been in the restorative space in schools and workplaces for about 30 years. So the initial trials that we started in Australia were 30 years ago, and I helped set those trials up and manage the process and have been involved in the restorative space ever since as both a facilitator, author and practitioner. So Joe and I also kind of met online. I think we met in 2018 at the conference in Minnesota, or one of the many conferences in Minnesota. But it was so hard to write because A, we wanted to get it right. Um, and secondly, because the science is changing so rapidly, and that we both felt very strongly about some of the things that people get wrong. Have I got
Yeah,
that right?
yeah, yeah, totally. And also, I think we both talked about the fact of having just writer's block. Like we
Yeah.
both struggle with writer's block trying to write this book, and some of it was a little bit of perfectionism about there were just so many books coming out about that time. Laurie DeSottles had put out some amazing books, and then
Bruce
Bruce
Perry.
Perry had put out, with Oprah Winfrey, their book "What Happened to You," and then Gabriel Maté put out "The Myth of Normal," and Lisa Feldman Barrett put out the book about constructing emotions, how emotions are made. I mean, there was just so much research to do that we felt like to leave any of this important stuff out was just like negligent. Like we had to get up to speed. And I think we both joked. Well, I'll just ask you, how much money did you spend on books?
Hundreds of dollars, hundreds
Right.
of dollars.
I swear my
Yeah.
husband just looked at the credit card bill and he's still, it was entertaining. But so I remember the first when we finally got through the writer's block, I remember the first chapter. We came up with these like really cool ideas of brainstorming.
Mm.
And then from the brainstorming on Google, we had this Google document. We just brainstormed. Here's what we're going to write about, which was just chaos. And then at one point, we took all the chaos and we said, all right, here's some possible chapters. And I remember the first chapter that you, quote unquote, took a stab at.
Mm.
And it was the chapter about behaviorism.
Our starting
And
point.
I
Mm.
remember reading that chapter and going, "Oh my God, this is going to be our book. This is where we're going." Like, and I remember being super excited because I hadn't written a goddamn thing. So I was like, "Wow, this is what our starting point's going to be." And I was so like encouraged and I just was amazed at this incredible chapter. And I knew exactly what I wanted to add to it. But tell me, or tell Molly's viewers, like when you were writing that chapter about behaviorism, like what is it that people get wrong about behavior?
Well, they don't understand how brains work, Joe. That's basically it. It's basically it. And there are so many. I mean, Australia and New Zealand, where I do a great deal of my work, and Joe, of course, works across North America. But so many of the programs around behavior are around how do you get kids to be more compliant, and we talk about behavior management when when my mind goes to, no, that's not the job. That's not the job anymore. It's not about hurting kids, so that they're obedient. It's about helping them to become the best human beings that they can possibly be. But that means behavior development, not behavior management. So, Joe, just take us down the path a little bit about why the brain is so significant in understanding what motivates us to do what we do.
Yeah, I think, to start with, we have to ask the big question, like, why
Mm.
do we have a brain? And that's the first place we get it all wrong, right? We think we have a brain.
Sometimes I worry about the fact, do I even have one?
Well, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
We're both having
Mm.
that issue. But why do you have a brain? Why, I mean, we can figure out why various things in the body evolved, through evolution, through natural selection. So what is it about evolution that gave humans these big, monstrous brains? Which one, our brain isn't actually that big compared to our size. It actually is pretty proportionate to our size and body. And the thinking about our brain is that its big function is to reproduce and keep you alive, which those things are not untrue, but they are not the primary function of the brain. The primary function of a brain is to balance out what Lisa Feldman Barrett calls the body budget. Allostasis, to keep your brain and your body running efficiently. Because otherwise, you eat up all your calories and your body won't be able to function to do those other things like stay alive, reproduce, all the fun stuff. But the first things first, the main job of a brain is to manage this budget. And it's not a financial budget, it's a budget of glucose, sodium, calories, energy. It's got to go to the right
Hormones.
places at the right time.
Mm.
And so I think where we get it wrong about behavior is we think that the brain is sitting around, because behaviorism says that the brain is dormant, sitting around waiting for an antecedent to like kick off some behavior. But that's just not how the brain works. The brain works not in response to the world, but in prediction of it.
Mm.
It would be too inefficient to do it any other
Mm.
way.
So, Joe, if I just want to hammer that prediction piece
Yeah.
before you keep going. The brain, the brain's whatever the brain's function is, it uses an enormous amount of energy, and so
Calories.
absolutely. So then the business of routines and habits are built around the notion of how can we be the most efficient at managing our affairs, the affairs of the body, the affairs of whatever you're talking about. And so the brain is a giant prediction machine.
Yes.
And I'll let you take that over, Joe.
Well, if you think about sports, that's a great example, right? If I were to throw a ball to you, Marg,
Mm,
right, and your brain was a stimulus response creature, like behaviorism would
mm,
say, right, you'd be waiting around to see what the ball does to try and catch it. Except that's incredibly an inefficient way to burn calories. You'd burn a ton of calories in a very inefficient way, and you probably get smacked in the face anyway. So the brain doesn't wait around waiting to see what the ball does. The brain predicts what's going to happen next. And you wonder, well, what does that have to do with little kids and behavior? Our thinking in schools and for, the last 50,
decades.
60, 100 years,
Mm,
if not 100, more, is that we are stimulus response creatures, but we are not. Your brain isn't laying around dormant, waiting for something to come wake it up, like we talk about. So, in schools, we're all looking for the function of the behavior, right? So we look for the antecedent, what triggered it off. But that's just simply not how a brain works. So when we look at little Billy and we say, "Oh, he's just reacting to the fact that he got told no," brains don't do that. Brains don't care about what already happened. Brains care about what's going to happen. And so the brain isn't reacting to, it's preparing for. And so when you know that about a brain, and then you see the behavior of a child, you can then start understanding that that child isn't reacting to you. They're preparing for what their brain and their body believe is coming next. So if little Billy can't sit still, if little Billy can't pay attention, it's likely that the brain in that child is predicting by three things: their five senses, their inner senses, like interoception, like have I had enough to drink? Did I get breakfast this morning? Did I sleep enough? It's taking all that sensory information and mixing it with the only thing it's got, past experience. And so if all of my past experiences have been not so great, then my prediction system is telling me that what's coming is going to be bad. So I'm not reacting to that. I'm preparing. Fight, flight, freeze, and faint are not reactions, they're preparation. And when you think about a child's behavior, that makes a huge difference in how we as educators and adults and supporting figures, supporting other humans, it makes a difference in how we, here's the word, respond, not react, how we respond to them.
Mm.
That makes all the difference.
Huge. So there's a lot, Joe, that we have to unlearn because we've all been socialized around punishments and rewards, have we not? There's a whole industry built around behaviorist approaches, uh, which had their beginnings with Pavlov and Skinner and Watson and a few others in that space.
Let's
But
not forget LaBosse.
yeah, yeah, well, I'll come to that in a minute. But yeah, settle down, mate. And eh, we just we have predict our brains are predicting as well. So if those experiences of ours have been laid down, we're going to have to unlearn a whole bunch of bad habits, uh, which can be informed by the more modern and more accurate neuroscience of relational neurobiology. So I also want Joe, because he gets very excited about it.
I do.
I want to ask him about applied behavioral analysis and son of applied behavioral analysis called functional behavior analysis, and then tie it all up with a bow around positive behavior supports. We call it here in Australia positive behavior for learning. Um, and it just gets Joe and I very cranky. So
So
over
in the
to you.
States, we call that PBIS,
Yes. Yeah.
positive behavior intervention systems. And then there's some other, versions of it out there. But
So tell us what's wrong with it, Joe.
well, for starters, let's talk about where this came from. So
Yep.
applied behavioral analysis came from a guy named Ali Labas, who was again a student of our previous
Skinner.
Pavlov, Skinner, Watson, these previous psychologists who did all of their experiments on rats and pigeons and then tried to apply it to humans. Right there, we should have all run for the hills, but we didn't. And so one of the beliefs about behaviorism that Lavos took very seriously is that humans have no internal motivation, that all motivations come from outside of us. And that right off the top, what's wrong with that? Well, the assumption is that the issue is a motivation issue.
That
So
we have no free will.
that we have no free will, and I that part, it's not that it's that we have no motivation. We have no actual internal motivation, that we're only motivated to either do something because we'll get something or because we'll get punished for something. And so it's either a punishment, carrot or stick, punishment, reward. And that's how humans function. But that's not how humans function. And so way back when, those were very reasonable explanations. And quite frankly, if I didn't know any of this neuroscience and how brains work, I might even still buy into that stuff. But the reality is, even long ago, Maslow came along, who actually will, another conversation altogether, but he took his materials from the Blackfoot Nation, which is a Native American group who had this whole idea that we are actually motivated by human needs. And then, of course, Marshall Rosenberg took that over. But the idea is that we do have internal motivation, that kids are not waking up in the morning and trying to figure out how to make everybody's life miserable, that they're motivated and that we can't change their behaviors through motivation. So punishments and rewards assume that the problem is a motivation problem. So I must have to either up the ante of rewards or up the threats if I don't want it. So if I want a behavior, I up the ante on the reward. If I don't want it, I'm going to up the ante on the punishment. But what if motivation wasn't the problem at all? What if it's trauma, neurodiversity, lack of cognitive skill or executive function? What if it's other issues within the body that our favorite occupational therapists will tell you can cause anxiety and mental health struggles? What if the problem isn't that the kid isn't motivated, but the kid's just got other stuff going on? And unfortunately, behaviorism doesn't have an answer for that.
No, it doesn't.
And so it takes everything. The first thing that you hear people say is, let's find out the function of the behavior. So we'll do an FBA, which narrows the complexity of human behavior down to these like 4 or 5 things, right? That it's attention seeking, which is silly because we're humans and we're built on attachment. And of course we're attention seeking. We
Connection seeking, Jackie.
Connection seeking. We're actually, what we're doing is managing each other's body budget. You actually can come along and sort of help me manage my body budget, and I can help you because we're socialized creatures, we're herd creatures. And a lot of how we interact, our emotions are contagious. We are interconnected.
We're co-regulating, Joe.
We're co-regulating.
Or co-escalating.
Or
as the case
co-escalating. And
might
schools,
be.
both
Yeah.
of those are happening. So what's wrong with functional behavior assessments? What's wrong with ABA? You're barking up the wrong tree. Because if the problem isn't motivation and the problem is something else, you're doing all this stuff for a kid who doesn't need that. And while you're busy focused on behavior, you may not realize that that behavior could be adaptive in that child's world. So maybe it's maladaptive during math and science class, but at home, this is life-saving behavior. Like if I come from a family of 10 kids and the only way I'm going to get some food is to just take it and yell, that doesn't look so good at cafeteria time or snack time. But at home, that's the only way I'm getting some food. And so we tend to think of behavior as a child's, he knows better and should do better because they know better. You know the rules, you're not supposed to do that.
But they don't know what they're supposed to do. And the other interesting thing about they should know better is that many of the sort of social norms that we find, acceptable. For example, Rick came to the little corner store with me today to pick up some stuff that we needed for breakfast. And I said, come on, big game, don't wear shoes. And he said, but if I didn't wear shoes into a shop in America, I would be asked to leave. But Australians walk around bare feet all the time. I was almost tempted to wear bare feet for our keynote, Joe, but
in America, they just write songs about it. No shirt, no shirt, no shoes, no problem. Right?
But the cultural differences about the issues around good manners and stuff, you are taught in your family and culture and faith, if you like, even, but all of the spaces where you have you develop your social norms and your social skills is because there are regular routines that have become predictable.
So wait, let me get this straight, Marg. Let me just ask a question. So what you're saying is like a nod to Alex Chevron-Burnett, right?
Oh, yes.
Who reminds us that the punishments and rewards are pretty neutral. But what we call appropriate or inappropriate behavior is not neutral.
No, it's not neutral at all.
Tell me about that.
Well, and I can give you the clearest example because this is really easy. I started being invited to New Zealand for restorative work with schools about 20 years ago. And so I got on the plane and flew over and got my presentation all set up. And during the course of the morning, I sat on the desk out the front of the room we were in. And I had no idea that that was a cultural no-no, because in New Zealand, one does not put one's bottom on any kind of table where there would be the possibility of food. So I could not predict that. I do now because I have been shown. I wasn't punished, but someone very kindly said to me, Marg, don't do it here. And there are lots of other things that you do and don't. And that changes. We call that code switching, by the way. That changes according to, like if I came and stayed at your house, I would use up some of my energy and my body budget figuring out how things are done. And I would learn very quickly because I'm smart that way about what's offensive, what's helpful, what's not helpful. So when you came, I said, because they have their own bathroom, can you please wipe the screen down in the shower because we're trying to avoid glass cancer. So it's the simple things about how things get done around here uh, that can be taught so that they are predictable because we're trying to save energy all the time. And, some of the things that when kids are facing chaos, that means the thinking and cognitive part of their brain is very much reduced because the chaos creates so much use of energy.
So when you say it's the way we do things around here,
That's
right? So
culture.
let's add this idea of trauma informed to that,
Yeah,
right?
go on.
If I'm the kid that the way things are done around here is that I behave in a certain way to survive, and then I get into class and I think, well, that's the way things are done. But that might not be the way things are done respectfully in my class. What's that look like to an educator? I mean, you're a former biology teacher.
Yeah.
What's that look like in a teacher's eyes?
That's a kid who doesn't know how to behave properly, who hasn't learnt good manners, who's needs to be brought into line very quickly. And if that, I can nudge them and remind them, but if that doesn't work the first or second time, then they're going to feel some pain.
So what they're showing you might be some, in their little world, very adaptive, life-saving behaviors.
Yeah, it
But
well
in your
could well be.
classroom,
No,
they're
the
getting
answer
written
is
up for
no.
disrespect.
Yeah, yeah. And so there'll be, all sorts of consequences for the non-compliance around that.
So,
So
so what do we get wrong about trauma and kids in the classroom?
the total ignorance
Hmm,
of the adults in the school community about how brains work.
right.
And that is they're they're responding to their inner and outer worlds and their experiences trying to predict how to keep themselves safe, I think. And um and look, I feel really strongly that the best way into helping a kid learn how things get done around here is through a very strong, caring, warm but demanding relationship.
So what do you say to those educators out there? Because, we both hear this all the time, that trauma informed means and restorative practice, that it means we're lowering the expectations.
Oh my
What would you
God.
say about that?
Yeah. Well, I'd say that's an absolute nonsense. But Molly, most of your listeners and viewers will know about the Johari window. And
The social
so the
discipline window,
social
right?
discipline window, or there are a number of more positive titles for that Johari window, but where, you know, the collaborative space is high on demand and high on support. But people who are still wedded to the notions of behaviorism and consequences which are punitive, because the only way you learn to be obedient is to feel the pain, of course, but which is a nonsense. But my experience, because I've come to the trauma-informed stuff from a background in restorative and a background of biology, because we're warm-blooded, hairy mammals after all, who live best when we're connected and thrive best when we're connected in herds of one sort or another. It could be the football herd, it could be the choir herd, it could be the orchestra herd, it could be the classroom herd, it could be the family herd, it could be the neighbourhood herd.
Well, we're always looking for a herd.
Yes.
even if it's not a healthy one.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Well, so long as I belong and I matter, you know, and I'm seen. So the critics are of both. Never mind combining the approaches. The critics of both think it's a fancy way of doing nothing because the kids haven't learnt who the boss is and they haven't had enough pain to teach them not to do it.
And so what we both hear, and I
Mm.
bet before I even finish this sentence, you'll finish it for me. What we both hear in our workshops and we both hear in the criticisms when a kid does something that is not meeting the expectations or breaking the expectations is, you know, where's the consequences? Which of course is actually code for punishment because
Absolutely.
consequences just happen in the world. You go out in the
Mm.
rain, you get wet. I mean, that's a consequence. You
Mm.
treat your friends kind of crappy, you're not going to have friends. Like we could just use the natural consequences. But when you hear people talk about where's the consequences, what does that translate to us as trauma-informed restorative practitioners? When we hear, when we hear people saying that, what do you think they really want? What do they care about? What's important?
Well, they do want kids to be compliant. They do want sort of a less stressful classroom, and they want a less stressful life, and they want lower blood pressure, which I think are all incredibly fair. But we have to kind of get with the current science of it. So if we're asking anyone, an adult, a child, a middle-aged person, someone who's sort of on the outer edge of middle age, like I am, um, to change what we do, then that requires focused repetition until the new neural pathway is created. So I have an analogy about we have a term here in Australia and New Zealand called bush bashing. So we get into our big four-wheel drives. I don't personally have one, and I don't think I ever will. But you want to go driving through the bush. So if you drive through the bush the first time, you'll crush some grass. But if you don't go over that same pathway, that grass is going to stand up again eventually. So you have to go over that same pathway with focused repetition and plenty of reinforcement, but not reward. Reinforcement, that's different. And until the grass figures out that it's not worth growing there anymore. Now, that's an analogy. It's not strictly what it does, but we're actually literally, with practice, changing the structure of our brain. And it's there are no shortcuts. There are no sort of silver bullets. There are no quick fixes. This is relational work that requires goodwill, mutual interest, mutual enjoyment, and trust. And so, when we talk about what people think about consequences, and this is a really important conversation to have, I am reminded about the underlying principles of restorative justice in education, or we call it RP here in Australia and New Zealand, restorative practice. But there are four. One is inclusive decision making. That's rule one. It's an underlying principle one. And that means if you're in the problem, you're in the problem solving. So the classic case in schools is if a kid is disrespectful of a teacher, has sworn at them and stormed out and had the whole hissy fit and done the fight, flight, business, taken off, run away, whatever, no matter how old, um, then their re-entry meeting should involve the teacher. But so often it doesn't, and it becomes a process of transaction, not transformation. And so many of our consequences are transactional, and they're not remotely paying any attention to the rupture in the relationship or the need to repair. So that inclusive decision making is, for me, really central. If you're in the problem, you deserve the opportunity to participate in the problem solving. Secondly, active accountability. And that is not about writing a letter of apology and posting it to your teacher or putting it in their pigeonhole. This is the work that is done with each other in the same room, where we can see our body language and we can see the whites of our eyes. The third thing is something everyone who knows anything about restorative practice would understand, and that is repair, the work that's needed to make things right after, there's been a wobble. And the last bit, which people don't really, although I think, Jo, the trauma-informed stuff talks about safety all the time, but really it's about trust. How do we get it back when it's been destroyed? And it's not a quick once-off. I've got to suck it and see, really, to see whether I can trust you after this meeting. But we make plans for it and we plug away. It's slow work. It is very slow work, and it's one of the things that makes implementation of both these approaches, either separately or together, difficult, because people are looking for a quick fix. Jo, do you want to add to that?
Well, I know that, like, one of the things we see, and I see all of the things, I mean, I agree complete with that, because I see very similar things in the US. But one of the struggles I see in the US with this implementation, with this work, is that I don't always think that teachers don't want to do this, and they do care about kids in trauma. I think what I hear, and we both hear this, is that the mental health of kids right now is tanking. We see the statistics of increases in suicide attempts. We see the increases of children on multiple antipsychotics and antidepressants and anti-anxiety medicines at really young ages. We're seeing children presenting with mental health disorders even earlier and earlier. We can blame that on screens. We can blame that on
COVID.
lack of social stuff. We could blame it on COVID and the pandemic. But what we're seeing and what we hear from teachers is they want to do this stuff. But instead of having, two kids in their classroom that are displaying these traumatic, these symptoms of trauma, the percentages we're seeing are up to 25, 30, 40% of a classroom. So if you've got 30 kids in your class, that's a very large number of children. And then we have one teacher with these 30 students, 10 of whom are melting down. How do we do this repair? How do we do this? How does this work when you have 10 kids in your class? Like, and I both know we get this question probably more frequently than any other question, which is why I'm throwing it out there for us to, like, sort of unpack is, how do we as trauma-informed restorative practitioners support educators and principals when so many kids within our school systems are struggling with so much? And now you add to that, climate change and floods and fires
and elections
and elections. And like, how do we go back to educators and support them? Like, what do we say to those educators who are like, this sounds great, I'm one person and there's 30 of them and 10 of them are melting down and I can't do a damn thing about it? What do we say to those people?
Well, and my answer to that is, how long is a piece of string? All right, and it can be very long or very short, but the work really needs to start with the adults, Jo. That's what I would say. And if we help adults to understand their own brains and their own responses to the stuff that's going on for them that is chaotic, then we've got some place where we can work both with the teachers and the leadership within a school. So adults go first with this stuff. You can't do this work with a kid or a group of kids unless you know what's going on in your own, in your own cognitive space, in your own emotional space, in your own kind of, oh my God, this is too frightening for me space, really. And so I think the becoming restorative or becoming trauma-informed or becoming trauma-informed restorative has to start with us. And then, and only then, can we use the extraordinary resources that are around, like this book, this little book with Ginger Healy.
We love Ginger.
Yes, and she just pumps out books like Laurie does. Oh my God, I don't know
Laura DeSottles, yeah.
where she finds the
We
time,
don't know where
but
Laurie sleeps. We're not sure she does.
yes. But I think it's a learning, we're learning together. There's this beautiful Maori word in New Zealand that is pronounced ako, but it's AKO, and it's the teacher is teaching students, but the students are teaching teachers. So it's a kind of we're in it together. We're learning from each other. So that's a very broad, not a specific question. So that's a really hard question to answer, Joe, but you might have a short version of what I'm trying to say.
I think sometimes what we see, and I know because you and I have talked about that. I mean, you and I have spent hours and hours and hours off of this camera talking about this work and trying to hash it out and grow and learn from each other. And I think we both see this one thing is that everyone's, we've missold these ideas to schools as the response to behavior. And it really needs to be sold to schools as the prevention, right?
Absolutely.
Instead of like, you know, instead of us teaching everyone better ways to put out fires, let's start talking about the ways you prevent them. And I think what people miss about trauma informed and about restorative practice, it's not about having a better alternative to suspension. It's not about knowing what to do when little Billy melts down. It's about knowing how to prevent those things because you've filled your school with the right stuff like co-regulation, connection, respect agreements, community building circles that build relationships, relationships between students and students, students and teachers, teachers and educators and parents and community. How does community play a role in your school? I think when we start to understand, and in this work, you always hear people talk about that idea of going upstream. Like, that old adage that, the village where they found all of these, people floating in the river, and everyone's coming up with these amazing ways to save the people that are drowning in the river until somebody says, hey, why don't we go upstream and find out where they're falling in? And I think this work we get so focused on what to do about not suspending and having an alternative when the two kids fight that we should start asking, well, why are they fighting? Well, why didn't we put the things in place to have better conflict resolution? Or, what is it that we can do to make schools? And I think when we say in both of these books that we've put out that there are practical ways to change culture and behavior, that really what we're saying is that if we fill a school with more cues of safety, more cues of relationship, and less, hey, if you're good, I'll give you some stickers. I know, she's shaking her head. For those of you that can't see this, she's shaking her head. If we put in the prevention, we see this work. And I know one of my schools, I'll give a hat tip to one of my schools, back in Connecticut, which is, in the northeastern part of the United States, that we have a really amazing school there that started restorative, community building circles every morning from 9 to 9:20. They do a quick, morning circle. And the kids have really learned to connect with each other in those circles to the point where they're terrified of missing what they call they call it relationship block. So like, oh, will I miss relationship block? Like they don't, so tardies have gone down, absenteeism has gone down, and kids are literally terrified that they'll miss circle. Why? Because they built those relationships. And if I care about the other kids in my circle, I'm gonna have a lot less fights and mishaps and bad expectations because I care socially. And we both know that there's a role of shame in
Huge.
that, because if I want to connect with the people around me, then shame suddenly matters. So can you just briefly tell me, like, what's the role of shame in this work? That's
Okay.
not a
Yeah.
brief
No,
conversation,
that's
but
a whole,
I'm
that's a
throwing it
whole,
at you anyway.
it's a whole chapter. But look, we're wired, as warm-blooded hairy mammals, we're wired to live in connection with each other. And so there's wiring in our brain, which I will make an analogy. It's a social alarm that will let you know when your relationship with someone else is off, right? So it might be, oh, that was a bit nasty, or he didn't say good morning to me, or a big one would be the kid who's been publicly humiliated in a classroom and doesn't have good conflict competence, so will just absolutely lose it, swear at the teacher and storm out. So the teacher has inadvertently, because they don't know better, humiliated the kid in front of other kids. That's not a good thing to do. So the response, the brain reacts in the child to get the fight, flight, and nasty language. So that's now going to humiliate the teacher, who's going to feel incredibly insulted and disrespected. So the fact that we have the capacity to kind of feel, well, our brain, it translates into a feeling or emotion, if you like, which we have called shame, but there are other words like embarrassment or awkward or shy or humiliated or patronized. There's all sorts of words. But this is an indicator that we should pay attention. And it's telling us the relationship is not right. Go get it sorted so the relationship can get back to a state of allostasis, actually, where both parties are no longer consumed with, I hate that other person's guts, or I'm frightened to be at school, or I don't want to go to that class anymore. But I want to take you back, Joe, so shame is good. It's neither good nor bad, but it is profoundly important in social regulation. That is the quality of the relationship between two people, or the teacher and a whole class, or in fact across the entire
So
school community. Yeah.
what's the role when we use punitive discipline
Oh, you
on
shame.
children? What's the shame element to that?
Well, they're being told that they're a bad person, as opposed to, the differential. I mean, we all know about separating the deed from the doer, but when you punish someone, then you shame them. And in the behaviorism context, I suppose, it is, well, you didn't like feeling like that, so you're not going to do this anymore. But actually, in all of the studies around young people from punitive situations and trauma situations, like trauma is inherently shaming. It is an accomplice to the bad thing that's gone wrong. So if you've suffered, any number of adverse childhood experiences, shame is just wired into your brain. And there is no separation from I am a failure and a flawed human being to I've done something bad, which I can fix. So the actual motivation from a brain perspective is to go right the wrong. But if you're raised in a culture where that's not done, it gets programmed out of you. So a lot of the behavior that we see, like school refusal and telling porkers about, no, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. It was the kid next door, or or the kind of self-harm that we see happening. Or the worst of it is if I experience shame, then the only way I can manage that is to make you feel worse about you. So that becomes the kind of story around bullying and sarcasm and put downs and, trolling on social media and all of that kind of stuff. So it makes me feel better about me, but I'm doing it at your expense.
Is there a role in that when kids have been shamed enough through abuse and neglect and trauma that they start to believe I am bad,
Oh, yes.
and then my teacher comes along and starts praising me.
Well, you don't know what to do with it.
So what's a kid's reaction to that? If you're a
Well,
traumatized kid, what's praise do?
it doesn't help, and they won't. I think they'll think you're not authentic.
So
That's what I think.
mistrust.
Oh,
It
yes,
brings up the
absolutely.
mistrust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what do they want from me? That kind of a deal. But look, I think again, the educational piece is extraordinary. So when I do this work in workplaces where I'm hearing people in my, pre-conference workshops talking about stuff that means they believe they're flawed. There is something wrong with them. When I work with them around the information to do the shame, they're incredibly relieved. You mean this is my shame speaking, not that I am a flawed person. Anyway, it's a concept and a model that I was introduced to in my very earliest days of understanding about restorative practice, and I can tell you it was a game changer for me. Absolute game changer. But I want to go back to something, Joe, that you just said, and we need to wind up shortly, I think.
No, because you also,
Yeah.
we could go for hours
Yes.
talking. We literally do go for hours talking about stuff.
Yeah, wherever we can. Is that the structure of a high school setting
Mm.
means that high school teachers have to be speed daters. We don't have the opportunity to spend an entire school day with one class of kids, so that in some respects the social and relational skills of a high school teacher have to be absolutely spot on, because there is no opportunity to waste in terms of, just even the way you greet kids as they come at the door. Just the simple small things that a child, for that very minute millisecond of time, nanosecond, that touch point, Joe, is if Joe comes in and I'm there to greet him and I'm genuine, he knows that for that moment, he matters to me.
And that would be true of elementary and primary school
Yeah.
teachers who in the US are called specialist teachers.
Oh, yes,
Right. So
absolutely. Because
so I
they're,
get this kid twice a week along with every other kid in the school of 600. And I'm supposed to build relationships with 600 kids. And the idea is like we have to be mindful of what we mean in this work by relationship. Like you don't have to
mm,
be this kid's best friend and you don't have to know everything
no.
about them, but you have to have those touch points, right? And so use the word touch points, and I'm going to just use that as an excuse to, I know what they are, but I'm going to ask you so you could tell them, like, what are touch points? Like, what does it mean when you say that?
Oh, well, for me, it's that moment where I am predictably, well, it's a prediction thing, but I come to be a predictable person, but it is the meeting of our two brains. That's a touch point for me.
So it's a form of co-regulation.
Yes,
Trust,
absolutely.
trust. In other words, I have
Absolutely.
enough cues of safety from you
Yes.
that I'm okay with you. I'm okay
Yes.
around you.
Yes.
Okay, that's
That I'm
that's
safe,
awesome.
that I'm a safe person. And I think adults in school communities assume that because we think we're safe, a kid feels that we're safe. But we don't know what their experience is of someone who looks like me or smells like me or who is my age or the color of my skin, or do I have an accent? Well, I do have an accent. It's an Australian accent, for God's sake.
And
um,
everything sounds cooler when she says it.
yeah. Uh, so so don't underestimate that moment of that connection will tell a child everything about you in that moment. Our brains are so clever in picking up the cues, but don't forget those cues are decided by whether they've had enough sleep, whether they've eaten, the color of the walls, whether uh,
So much.
and their past experiences. And I'll never forget reading in one of Bruce Perry's book about that kid who couldn't
You're talking about
relate.
Samuel and Old Spice, aren't you?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, the
Yes. I
child,
wish we could tell you that story. It's
yeah, the
great.
child, who couldn't relate to his new teacher, but and no matter how this young teacher was so wonderfully relational, he just
And
couldn't connect with
supportive and
this kid. And it was only because Bruce was in therapy with the child that he discovered that the old spice that this teacher, the aftershave that the teacher was using was the same that this kid's father had been using, and
which was abusive and
he was very violent. And my joke when I tell this story in training is that I can understand why anyone is traumatized by the smell of Old Spice, actually.
unconscious. Right?
Yes.
But you even think about that as and if you go back to behaviorism, like we bring this back to where we started. Teachers are always saying, like what's the antecedent? What was the trigger? Like what brought this on? And they think they know.
Hmm.
And I think that story about Old Spice is just a great reminder to say, if you are you seriously telling me that as a psychologist, as a human, as an educator, the counselor, that you could look at a child and say the antecedent is X, when the antecedent is actually the smell of someone's cologne or the color of a wall or the smell of, we always say that we put diffusers in classrooms, which I'm not against, but you just have to be mindful of your students. But I mean, you do these things, and then all of a sudden, some students responding poorly because they were actually someone that, had something horrible happen to them in a room that smelled like lavender. And like, we don't always recognize what those antecedents are because it's impossible to figure
And
that out.
and Joe, the kid would never be able to say, actually, it's the color of the walls or the
Yeah, the
smell of
kid
the
doesn't
room,
know.
or
You know,
uh,
I
you
think
know,
most of us don't know that those things. I mean, and it's one of the things we tell teachers, and I've said this a bunch of times, is the number one strategy teachers could take tomorrow in their classroom is to start figuring out your own antecedents, your own. I hate the word triggers, but what are the activators of your nervous system? What are the things that kids do that activate your nervous system? Maybe they roll their eyes. Maybe it's when they disrespect someone. Maybe it's when they
or
don't
they're
do something or do something.
or
Like,
they're not
what are
paying
those things?
attention to the words of wisdom that are
Right.
dropping out of your
If
mouth.
educators know their own activators of their own nervous systems, then they can actually learn to manage that to be to be more regulated. And that doesn't mean calm. It just means that the energy level you have matches the task at hand. And so knowing that and knowing we could go on for hours,
Yeah.
what is that like? And I'll ask, we could ask each other this question too when we're trying to sell books, because we are, and I want to be clear to like listeners, man, when we say we want to sell books, we do not make a ton of money off this book. Like we make no money off books, period. These are not the kind of books that make people rich,
Hmm.
but there are books that I can't even begin to tell you how much research, reading, writing, rewriting, editing, beating each other up we did about writing this book. And so of course we want you to read it. So what is in this book that you would tell people like you got to buy this book because of this? Like what's in this book that why would you want people to buy this book? What's your taxi speech? It's like what
Well,
you sell it to a taxi driver?
actually, if I hadn't co-written it, I would buy it because it's a damn good book. And it has, there are lots of schools that claim restorative and lots of schools that claim trauma informed, but there is not enough, and we must create a conference one day, Joe, which has both,
Yeah.
so that people can come and talk about it. But it's about how we've threaded those two very strong messages together, and you really realizing that you can't be restorative unless you're trauma informed, and you can't be trauma informed if you're still using, the whole nonsense about behaviorism and punitive consequences. So come on, get with the modern stuff and help us overcome the evidence practice gap. There you go.
That's a good answer.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, yeah.
And so I think my answer to the same question would be let's stop using 17th and 18th century tactics on 21st century kids, right? Let's start, I want to see it. I want to see us get to a point where restorative justice isn't seen as some hippy dippy, and that's your words,
Mm.
hippy dippy, sort of fluffy. Like this is based in the science, and people say that there isn't the data to show that it works, but there is the data to show that it works. There's lots of data to show that it works. But more importantly, it's just a more human way of being human,
Mm.
if that makes
It
any
is.
sense. And that's,
It,
and I'll
it
stop
is.
talking there.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So we will pull it up, but with the invitation that Joe and I are both contactable. We get to see each other in June next year in the States, which will be wonderful after all these years of just being e-pals, really. But yeah, we're good for spreading the word, and we'd both be happy to help either together or separately. So we'll leave you there and wish you well for your trauma-informed restorative journey. So see you later. Bye.